The morning started like any other until I stepped outside to find my car gone, vanished without a trace. A bright red toad notice slapped on the driveway like some cruel joke, and I knew instantly who was behind it. HOA Karen, that fat, tyrannical nightmare who ruled our neighborhood with a combination of fear, fines, and a disturbing love for chaos. She thought she could intimidate me into submission, but she had no idea who she was dealing with, because what she didn't know was that before she became the self-appointed sheriff of petty grievances, I had spent years in the military, trained in sniper operations, guerrilla tactics, and a very particular kind of vengeance. And as I stared at the empty space where my car had been, my mind raced through scenarios so precise, so satisfying, that even the thought made my blood hum with anticipation. And I wasn't just angry, I was plotting, scheming, and calculating her downfall with surgical precision. The HOA had been meddling in my life for months, fining me for imaginary infractions, scrutinizing every inch of my property like a pack of vultures circling a meal. But today they had crossed the line, and in that instant, I decided that no polite warnings, no phone calls, no passive-aggressive letters would suffice. This needed a spectacle, something that would leave every single HOA member frozen in disbelief, and I immediately knew what it had to be, because subtlety was for cowards, and the sheer audacity of a 20-ton tank parked in my driveway, its metal hulking over the neighborhood like a silent predator, was exactly the statement I intended to make. I spent the next hours secretly contacting a military surplus dealer under a pseudonym, arranging logistics that would make moving a small building look simple, and as the sun climbed higher, I watched Karen's minions gossip and plot, oblivious to the storm that was coming, blissfully unaware that the next time she came near my property, she would be staring. Not at an empty driveway, not at a little inconvenience, but at a living, breathing symbol of consequences, a tank with a license plate that read payback. And the thrill of it, the idea that she would finally realize that all the power she thought she had was meaningless against someone who knew the real meaning of leverage, made me grin like a predator circling its prey. By mid-afternoon, the tank was on its way, moving through back roads, past curious neighbors who assumed I had gone insane. And as it rumbled onto my property with the ground shaking beneath it, I stood at the edge of the driveway, arms crossed, imagining Karen's face when she arrived to deliver another petty threat and found a literal armored fortress blocking her path. And in that moment, I realized revenge wasn't just about justice. It was about spectacle. It was about sending a message so loud that no fine, no threat, no HOA memo could ever erase it from her mind. And as the engine's growl faded into an eerie silence that blanketed the cul-de-sac, I knew this was only the beginning, because a fat, entitled HOA president had just met her match, and her reign of terror had finally hit a wall of steel, and I had front row seats to watch it all unfold. Karen's fury hit the moment she turned the corner and saw my driveway dominated by the massive silhouette of the tank, its turret glinting under the midday sun like a beacon of humiliation, and she froze in place, her jaw slack, arms flailing wildly as she yelled at no one in particular, her voice echoing down the cul-de-sac while the neighborhood watched in stunned silence, whispers spreading like wildfire as people realized that the petty little HOA president they had always seen gossiping over miniature cupcakes and clipboard orders was now being utterly humiliated by a property owner who clearly had no concept of too much, and in fact had gone way past any form of conventional retaliation. Her face, bright red and glistening with sweat, was a mixture of disbelief and rage, and as she fumbled for her phone, probably to call the local police or threaten lawsuits, I could see the panic setting in behind her thick glasses, the kind of panic that comes from realizing you have just poked a sleeping giant who has all the resources, skills, and audacity you could never hope to match, and she started pacing, muttering threats under her breath about fines, towing, insurance violations, and whatever other meaningless bureaucratic weapon she thought she could wield, completely unaware that the tank's armor made every one of her threats laughably impotent. And I watched from the porch, arms crossed, feeling the electric thrill of victory as neighbors peeked through curtains, kids pointed from behind bicycles, and mail carriers slowed their steps to catch a glimpse of the surreal scene unfolding. Karen's minions, a group of overweight, nervously twitching HOA enforcers who usually paraded around with clipboards and smug expressions, had no idea how to respond, hesitating in the street like deer caught in headlights, and when she finally screamed for them to do something, it became clear that no amount of shouting or bureaucratic authority could undo what had been done, and I began to imagine the domino effect that would ripple through the neighborhood over the next hours, days, even weeks, as the tale of the tank in the driveway would inevitably become legend, shared at barbecues, whispered in offices, posted on neighborhood chat groups, and viral videos capturing Karen's incredulous expressions would rack up thousands of views in minutes. While she attempted desperately to negotiate, pleading for sympathy, promising compliance, dangling bribes, and spouting legal jargon she barely understood, all to no avail because my position was absolute and unshakable. And as she threatened to call the police, I calmly reminded her, with a slow, deliberate smile, that the local authorities had better things to do than mediate the petty tantrums of a woman who had clearly underestimated me, and that, in fact, a call to the police might only accelerate the story, because the tank was fully registered, insured, and legally parked on my property, and every word she spoke against it could be documented for posterity, turning her own attempts at authority into evidence of her humiliation. And as she stomped around like a toddler denied candy, flipping through papers and pointing fingers, I couldn't help but savor the poetic justice of it all, the ultimate karmic balance in which a woman who had built her reputation on intimidation, micromanagement, and petty cruelty was being brought to her knees by sheer audacity, ingenuity, and a little military-grade flair. And by the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the asphalt and the gleaming steel, Karen had retreated to her car, muttering curses and plotting some half-baked scheme for revenge, while the tank sat silent and immovable in the driveway, a monument to what happens when you pick a fight with someone who refuses to play by the rules of your little tyrannical HOA. And as the neighbors slowly returned to their routines, glancing over shoulders and whispering in awe, I realized that this chapter of revenge had only just begun, because Karen's meltdown was the opening act, and I had countless ways to escalate, to twist, and to make sure that every inch of her territory and her ego would pay for her decades of harassment. And in that moment, standing on my porch with the hum of the tank's engine fading into a low purr, I knew one thing for certain. This was not just a win. It was the birth of a legend that would echo through the neighborhood forever. The morning air was thick with tension, a stillness that carried the weight of imminent chaos as Karen emerged from her oversized SUV, her face a mask of fury and disbelief, stomping across the cul-de-sac like a tyrant queen discovering her kingdom had been invaded by an unstoppable force. And every step she took seemed to reverberate through the neighborhood as though the pavement itself recognized the absurdity of the scene. My driveway, dominated by a 20-ton tank that gleamed menacingly in the sun, a behemoth of steel and raw intimidation, completely immovable and entirely legal, a monument to defiance that rendered every petty fine, every microscopic regulation she had ever tried to enforce, utterly meaningless. And the neighbors began to gather, drawn by the spectacle, their faces a mixture of fear, awe, and the kind of giddy disbelief that only comes when witnessing something so over-the-top it borders on surreal. And I watched from the porch, arms crossed, sipping coffee as Karen's voice, a piercing mixture of screams, threats, and accusations, cut through the morning air like a chainsaw, rattling windows and sending dogs barking wildly, her words bouncing off the armored surface of the tank, powerless, ricocheting back at her as though the machine itself were mocking her. And with every futile attempt to assert control, her face grew redder, sweat dripping down her temples, mascara streaked by fury, the sheer audacity of the situation clearly overwhelming her. While she waved arms in dramatic flourishes, pointing fingers, flipping through documents, threatening legal action, and shouting at invisible authorities who had no jurisdiction over the reality in front of them, and then the HOA minions arrived, a gang of flustered, flabby bureaucrats who had spent years acting as the muscle for Karen's reign of terror, clipboards clutched to their chests, attempting to organize, coordinate, negotiate, but all their efforts were instantly nullified by the immovable presence of the tank, its turret angled just so, catching sunlight like a predator watching its prey, and Karen barked orders at them, shrieking for them to tow it, move it, or even summon some government agency, any authority that could bend reality to her will. But as they shuffled awkwardly, muttering excuses and feigning competence, the absurdity of their impotence only magnified the hilarity and satisfaction of the situation for me, because I knew exactly how each moment would play out in her mind. A complete loss of control, humiliation broadcast not just to neighbors who were now filming on their phones, but to anyone who would ever hear the story shared across social media, endlessly mocked, memes born instantly, her legacy as a petty, overbearing tyrant collapsing in real time under the weight of sheer spectacle, and the tank, silent and unyielding, became a character in its own right, a looming, metallic reminder that rules, fines, and threats had limits, that audacity and preparation could render even the most rigid enforcers powerless. And Karen, now pacing in circles, muttering to herself, trying to strategize, scheming desperately for ways to reclaim authority, plotting potential lawsuits, insurance claims, and maybe even calling in media to try to shame me, failed utterly, because everything she had counted on, every assumption about obedience, fear, and leverage, had been shattered in an instant. And the neighbors, emboldened by the spectacle, began to murmur, whisper, and even laugh, some approaching cautiously to ask questions, others recording videos, capturing every contorted expression of rage, every frantic gesture, every vain attempt to restore control, while I leaned back, savoring the unfolding chaos, already imagining the endless retellings, the commentary, the sense of satisfaction that comes from absolute victory over someone who had for so long abused authority. And as Karen tried to summon more reinforcements, I noticed her phone call after phone call going unanswered, local police dispatchers politely reminding her that the tank was perfectly legal, fully insured, and entirely on private property, and each refusal to act added layers to her panic, making her gestures more frantic, her shouting louder, her humiliation more public, until it reached a fever pitch where neighbors were openly mocking her behind her back, kids mimicking her shrieks, social media notifications lighting up across town, and Karen, realizing that she could neither intimidate, coerce, nor outmaneuver me, began plotting desperate tactics, from trying to bribe neighbors, secretly mobilize HOA members, or even contacting media outlets to spin the story in her favor. But each plan collided with the harsh reality of the situation. She had been outmatched, outclassed, and outmaneuvered at every turn, and as the sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows that highlighted the impossibility of her position, I began to set the next stages in motion, calling in small drones to hover around the tank, creating live streams, and making sure the neighborhood's attention remained fixed squarely on her unraveling control, all while Karen's screams became increasingly unhinged, blending panic with rage, her face a vivid portrait of frustration and disbelief. And in that moment, I realized something glorious. Not only had I exacted revenge for the car being towed, 4 months of petty harassment, for every tiny infraction and fine, but I had created an unforgettable spectacle, one that would cement my dominance over the HOA in a way that no bureaucrat, no lawyer, no angry mob of overweight HOA enforcers could ever reverse. And as Karen retreated briefly to her car, muttering under her breath and fuming in frustration, plotting further escalation, I smiled, because the tank was just the beginning, a first salvo, the opening chapter of a story that would only grow more absurd, more chaotic, more satisfying. And as the neighbors continued to film, whisper, and gape, I knew that every second of her humiliation, every failed threat, every frantic attempt at control would become part of a narrative that she could never erase. And as the afternoon stretched on, the tank gleamed silently, a testament to preparation, audacity, and patience, and Karen's mind, already fraying at the edges, continued to spiral, realizing that the petty world she had ruled with a clipboard and a megaphone was no match for someone who refused to be intimidated. And by the time the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the street, Karen was left defeated, exhausted, plotting in vain, while I calmly began outlining the next moves, the next layers of spectacle and humiliation, knowing that this was far from over, that the tank was not just a weapon but a statement, and that in this neighborhood, the rules had been rewritten, authority had shifted, and Karen, for all her rage, would never again be able to threaten me. Without thinking twice about the consequences of poking a sleeping giant armed with steel, strategy, and unshakable audacity. By the time dawn broke on the 4th day, the cul-de-sac had transformed from a quiet suburban street into a theater of chaos. As news of the tank in my driveway spread like wildfire, neighbors peeking nervously from behind curtains, kids sneaking cameras and live streaming every moment, and Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of authority, had descended into a level of panic that was almost comical if it weren't so infuriatingly tragic, her face red and glistening with sweat, hair sticking in disheveled spikes, her tiny SUV parked haphazardly in front of her mansion as she ran laps around it, waving a stack of legal papers, threats, and HOA rulebooks as if sheer volume could somehow magically immobilize a 20-ton armored vehicle. And with every step, she yelled at her underlings, desperate for solutions that did not exist, bellowing at the neighbors, the police, and even passers-by, trying to summon sympathy, outrage, or any authority that could bend the laws to her favor, while I stood on my porch, arms crossed, a slight grin curling across my lips, knowing that every second of her meltdown was being recorded, photographed, and catalogued in the neighborhood's collective memory as the day the unmovable tank humiliated the tyrant. And as I sipped my coffee, I began to carefully plan the next stage, because while the spectacle had already reached legendary proportions, the real fun was about to begin. I had arranged for remote-controlled drones to hover above the tank, broadcasting live feeds to social media, capturing every shriek, every futile gesture, every failed attempt at intimidation. And within hours, the story went viral, neighbors tagging friends, neighbors filming their reactions, kids running around pretending to take notes on the tank invasion. And Karen, realizing that she was not only powerless but also becoming a meme, began spiraling into an even more desperate frenzy, plotting everything from secret lawsuits to calling local TV stations, hoping to frame herself as a victim, but nothing could reverse the reality staring her in the face. Her reign of petty terror had ended, and she had been publicly humiliated in front of the entire community. Meanwhile, I began subtly encouraging a few brave neighbors to interact with her, offering helpful advice in a completely neutral tone, watching as she twisted into knots, caught between acting reasonable to save face and lashing out with her trademark fury, and every interaction became fuel for my amusement. Every phone call she made that went unanswered or politely declined adding layers of tension to her unraveling psyche. And as the sun climbed higher, the street began to resemble a war zone of absurdity, with Karen pacing furiously, HOA minions clumsily attempting to mediate, children running between houses with phones recording the spectacle, and me calm and collected, plotting the next escalation, because I knew that the tank alone, while devastating, was only the beginning. I arranged for a small entourage of military-style vehicles to appear subtly, just parked in the shadows of my property, hinting at a level of readiness that Karen could not possibly comprehend, and when she caught glimpses of them, her face paled, her voice trembled, and she began to mumble about insurance claims, hidden regulations and secret ordinances, none of which could apply to what was unfolding before her eyes, and the beauty of it was that she had no allies, no leverage, no support, only her mounting hysteria and the growing realization that the entire neighborhood was silently, or openly, watching her humiliation, while I quietly began coordinating the next phase, a series of small but perfectly timed accidents around her property. Subtle leaks, harmless but inconvenient obstructions, noises timed for maximum annoyance, all designed to keep her on edge, and as the day wore on, she tried increasingly ridiculous tactics, sending her minions to negotiate, attempting to hire private movers, even calling local politicians in a futile attempt to pressure me, but each attempt backfired spectacularly, because I had prepared contingencies for every possible move she could make, anticipating her rage-driven decisions with military precision, and every misstep she made only fueled my satisfaction further, as neighbors whispered about her unraveling sanity, capturing it all on video, sharing it on group chats, and speculating wildly about what she might do next. And by evening, the cul-de-sac had become a surreal carnival of chaos, a neighborhood united in awe and amusement, watching Karen, the once feared HOA tyrant, pacing like a trapped animal, shrieking, plotting, flailing, utterly powerless against a single property owner who had combined audacity, preparation, and a touch of dark humor to create an unforgettable spectacle. And as I finally turned my attention to dinner, I smiled, knowing that this chapter of humiliation was far from over, that the tank was only the opening act, and that tomorrow Karen would wake to find that the story had just begun, and every move she made would be carefully observed, anticipated, and when necessary turned into yet another layer of poetic justice, because in this neighborhood, the rules had changed, authority had shifted, and Karen, for all her rage, had learned the hard way that poking a sleeping giant armed with steel, strategy, and patience comes with consequences she could never undo. The next morning, a surreal tension had settled over the cul-de-sac, an almost electric anticipation in the air, as Karen emerged from her house looking like a hurricane had passed through her personal storm cloud, hair sticking out in every direction, makeup smudged into grotesque streaks, her oversized blazer hanging off her frame like a flag signaling surrender, clutching a stack of papers that included HO fines, insurance claims, angry letters, and hastily scribbled plans that she clearly hoped would intimidate anyone who glanced at them, but the neighbors, now fully aware that something extraordinary had unfolded in their street, gathered in small clusters, whispering, filming, and occasionally laughing out loud, because Karen's complete loss of control had become a neighborhood spectacle that no one could ignore, and as she stomped across the street to confront me yet again, voice rising to levels that shattered windows and made dogs bark, I remained on my porch, arms crossed, a calm smirk on my face, because every gesture she made, every frantic plea, every ridiculous threat was exactly what I had been waiting for, a live demonstration of the absolute collapse of her petty authority, and as she waved her papers in the air, I could almost hear the collective gasps of the neighborhood in disbelief at the absurdity of her desperation, while the tank sat immovable in the driveway, silent, menacing, and utterly perfect, a symbol of my preparation, audacity, and control. And as Karen began pacing in wild circles, muttering about towing companies, hidden laws, secret regulations, and what she imagined would be sympathetic authorities, I watched the perfect synchronization of chaos, because every move she made only reinforced the spectacle, turning her once feared persona into a cartoonish display of hysteria, And then, in an almost theatrical twist, she attempted to rally a group of HOA enforcers to her side, pointing at the tank and shouting orders as though sheer volume could bend reality, but the enforcers, flabby and timid, glanced at each other nervously, murmuring excuses, shaking their heads and refusing to act, clearly realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond their comfort zone, while I, from the porch, began orchestrating subtle, precise accidents designed to amplify her panic. Sprinklers timed to go off directly in her path, automatic garden lights flickering in her face, harmless but perfectly irritating noises strategically placed around her property, all designed to heighten her hysteria while keeping the neighborhood thoroughly entertained. And as the morning wore on, Karen tried increasingly absurd measures, calling local politicians, hiring private movers, attempting to enlist media coverage, and even sending passive-aggressive notes to neighbors in a desperate bid to shift public opinion. Yet every attempt was systematically nullified by my preparation, because I had anticipated every move she could make, every desperate action fueled by ego and rage, and countered it before she even had a chance to execute it, while drones hovered silently above, streaming the unfolding spectacle to social media, capturing her flailing, her screaming, her futile attempts to regain control, and the collective reactions of neighbors who could barely contain their laughter as they realized the once tyrannical HOA president had been utterly outmaneuvered by a single property owner armed with audacity, strategy, and a literal tank. And as the day progressed, her panic deepened into near hysteria, the combination of neighborhood attention, viral live streams, and constant reminders that she was completely powerless, transforming her into a caricature of rage and frustration. All while I calmly began to prepare the next phase, because the tank was only the beginning, a first salvo in a carefully choreographed series of humiliations designed to cement my dominance and ensure that every inch of her authority, every shred of ego, every inflated sense of control she had ever relied upon would be dismantled piece by piece. And the beauty of it was that she had no recourse, no allies, and no understanding of the scale of planning, patience, and audacity I had brought to bear against her. And as the sun reached its peak, casting stark shadows over the street and highlighting the surreal impossibility of the scene, Karen's body language, voice, and expressions revealed total surrender to panic, despair, and confusion as neighbors continued to whisper, point, film, and speculate wildly about the unfolding chaos, some daring to approach with questions, others keeping a cautious distance, while I calmly observed, taking note of her every frantic movement, anticipating her next irrational decision, and turning even the smallest misstep into further spectacle, as she realized that she had been completely outmatched, humiliated in front of the entire community, and that every attempt to reclaim control only amplified the narrative of her failure. And by evening, when shadows stretched across the street and the neighborhood had fully absorbed the scale of the absurdity, Karen was left pacing in despair, muttering to herself, frantically texting, calling, and planning desperate schemes, all of which I knew would fail. And as I finally relaxed on my porch, watching the tank glint in the fading light, silent and unyielding, I knew with absolute certainty that this chapter of revenge, chaos, and absolute domination had reached its peak for the day, that Karen's hysteria would continue to ripple through the neighborhood long after sunset, and that the story of the tank in the driveway, the ultimate humiliation of the fat, overbearing HOA president, and the complete collapse of her petty authority would become legend, told and retold, shared, recorded, and mocked in perpetuity, leaving her legacy forever entwined with defeat, spectacle, and the undeniable truth that audacity, preparation, and courage had triumphed over arrogance, bureaucracy, and tyranny. By the sixth morning, the cul-de-sac had become a theater of absurdity and chaos, a surreal battlefield where reality and spectacle collided as Karen, now fully unhinged, emerged from her house with her hair in wild tangles, face flushed with frustration and humiliation, clutching yet another stack of papers that contained angry HOA letters, hastily drafted legal threats, and notes for potential media outreach. And as she stomped across the street, shouting at anyone who would listen, neighbors peeking from behind blinds or stepping cautiously onto lawns to witness the spectacle, I stood calmly on my porch, a smug grin curling across my face, sipping coffee as I observed her every desperate gesture, because every frantic movement, every shriek, every wild attempt to assert authority only added to the growing legend of the tank in my driveway and her total humiliation. And as she waved her arms, shouting about fines, regulations, and imaginary violations, I noticed that even her minions, those overweight bureaucrats who had once carried her authority like a shield, were now avoiding eye contact, mumbling excuses and refusing to act, their feeble attempts at support rendered completely useless by the immovable, gleaming steel that dominated the space she once imagined she controlled. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that made the tank appear even more colossal and intimidating, Karen's panic escalated, her voice cracking, her gestures becoming frantic and erratic, while drones hovered silently above, capturing every moment and streaming it live to social media, ensuring that every gasp, every shriek, every absurd threat was broadcast far beyond the street, while neighbors whispered, laughed, and filmed, sharing the spectacle with friends, family, and online audiences who could barely believe the unfolding chaos. And as Karen attempted to rally the local police, calling repeatedly, I calmly reminded them that the tank was perfectly legal, fully insured, and entirely on private property, and the realization that no authority could save her from humiliation seemed to crush her spirit further. And in a final act of desperation, she attempted to negotiate directly with me, flinging papers, waving arms, trying to bribe, threaten, or manipulate me with a level of hysteria that was almost painful to watch. But I remained completely composed, arms crossed, silently enjoying every second of her unraveling as she realized that she had been utterly outmaneuvered, completely outclassed, and entirely humiliated in front of the neighborhood she had spent years terrorizing. And as the day wore on, I began implementing subtle new escalations. Lights flickering at key moments, harmless mechanical noises, sprinklers spraying in unpredictable intervals, all designed to keep her on edge, while the tank remained a silent, dominating presence, immovable and menacing, and the spectacle drew even more neighbors, some cautiously approaching to witness history in the making, others filming from afar, sharing videos and commentary that spread like wildfire, while Karen's voice grew louder, more desperate, more unhinged as she flailed, pacing in circles, muttering to herself, attempting to find any loophole, any rule, any ally, but realizing with growing horror that none existed, and the tank, silent and powerful, stood as a monument to my planning, patience, and audacity, a tangible reminder that authority based on petty rules and intimidation could be shattered by preparation, courage, and a little theatrical flair. And as the afternoon wore on, I noticed subtle changes in her strategy. Frantic emails, desperate texts to neighbors, erratic calls to local media, all attempts to salvage a shred of credibility or regain some semblance of control, yet each move backfired spectacularly, because every action she took played into the narrative I had crafted, amplifying her humiliation. And by evening, as shadows stretched across the street, the tank glinting ominously in the fading light, Karen was left exhausted, panicked, and completely defeated, pacing in circles, muttering incoherent threats, plotting further desperate schemes that I knew would fail before they were even conceived, while the neighborhood, captivated, entertained, and utterly amazed, whispered, recorded, and shared every moment of her public unraveling. And I realized that the climax of this chapter was near, that the culmination of her hysteria, my audacity, and the immovable presence of the tank had created an unforgettable spectacle, one that would forever redefine her legacy, the neighborhood's memory, and the meaning of absolute victory in a petty HOA feud. And as I watched her finally retreat to her house, muttering curses, shaking, and realizing that the rules of engagement had shifted permanently, I knew that the stage was set for the final act, that the ultimate humiliation, the final orchestration of chaos, and the conclusive proof of my dominance would soon arrive, because the tank was only the beginning, and the legend of Karen versus the unmovable behemoth on my driveway was far from over, with a crescendo of revenge and spectacle waiting to explode in ways that no one, not even Karen herself, could possibly anticipate.